Good morning. I got an extra question. If I don't read it now, I'll forget. Is it offensive to send greeting cards with pictures of white people to a black person? So since I was a little kid and was able to purchase cards, if I wanted to get a special card because of the words and it had a picture of a white person on the front of it, by the way, all of them had pictures of white people on the front of them, I would go get my brown crayon. So my suggestion to you is, if you have that thought that you should be getting a card that doesn't have a white person on the front of it, then that's probably the best follow your spirit answer. Now may I start? Good morning. Thank you, my friends, for allowing me to speak to you once again. I am humbled to be in this situation, responding to almost 20 questions that were presented to me. Let me begin with a disclaimer. I do not represent black women. I can't say that I even truthfully represent most black women. I will say to you that we as black women are as different as our upbringing and our lifestyles and as the color of our skin tones. With that difference, we all have our difference of opinions. Our experiences differ from city to country living, from north to south, from predominantly black communities to those of us that have lived in the presence of white people growing up. Still, I have asked black women and black men, and I have researched to learn the answers to some of your most thoughtful questions. You might be interested to know I decided on this sermon with an understanding that some of this might be the only way, the only opportunity that you get to ask these questions. I also understand that for some, the asking and answering is often difficult, awkward, and sometimes may even appear as rude and inappropriate. Yet I understand the only way to grow past bias or lack of understanding is to ask and answer. So I cut my hair. And to answer the first question, I don't mind if you touch it. But I ask, as most people have rules, but just as most people have rules about their personal space, so do black women. So ask first. And as with people, regardless of their color, you will find black women that will celebrate your curiosity and be willing to answer your questions. There'll be others who may be more guarded of their personal space. It could simply be a woman doesn't like the attention or she isn't willing to answer curious questions. Some choose to honor ancestors who had no choice in matters of their bodies and the horrendous acts that were put upon them by slave owners and their wives. Did you know that there was a superstition that involved rubbing a nigger's head for good luck? Touching a black woman's hair is simply about honoring her space and recognizing her as a person and not, as one writer described, on display at a hair petting zoo. I was asked several questions about growing up black. Did you recognize skin tone? When did you realize black and whites were treated differently? Were you a minority in school, or was your school mostly black? And what has been your experience with genealogy? First, my education about skin tones is actually surrounded in family genealogy. My mother's mother was Native American, and her husband's family is part of the Lenni Lenape tribe. My mother's sisters and brother had dark hair and fair skin and could easily be mistaken for Italian. There was more awareness of color and color differences among folks that looked white in my mother's family than actually dealing with white people. The neighborhood that I grew up in was all black, except for an older couple, the Thompsons, who lived next door. There's probably a whole story about the whites moving out of the neighborhood once the blacks began to move in. And while I know there were places that black people didn't live, it wasn't until very recently that I learned that was part of the redlining process. It seems to me that both my elementary and high school had a fair amount of blacks to whites. At dinner the other evening, my sisters and I were discussing the questions that you asked me, and we talked about the cafeteria. And although my sisters reminded me that although we were not forced into segregation, most of the white kids ate in one cafeteria and the blacks ate in another. I don't remember which cafeteria I ate in, but I will tell you that my sister said she ate in the cafeteria with her friends who were white. My younger sister Andrea and I also talked about the question of identifying as black or African American. Andrea, who's 10 years younger than me, proclaimed that she doesn't like using the word black. A survey conducted by Gallup in 2007 concluded that while most people of African descent have no preference, those that did preferred the term black only slightly more than those who liked to be preferred as African American. This doesn't include those that are born in Africa and Caribbean countries. Yet some folks have strong feelings about how they are identified. Journalist Tynesa McCullough writes, "Black is not a dirty word, and it should stop being treated as such by all people." I clearly remember when my father began using the word black instead of colored to identify us. I remember how proud I was to shout, "Black power! I'm black and I'm proud!" The bottom line is the way you hear people of color refer to themselves is the way that you should respond. But in most situations, we will not be offended either way. I was asked about the African American vernacular. My response is, quite frankly, I don't know how we label the speech of those of African descent that speak differently than me, whether it's cultural slang or indigenous. But I read an article recently that said those children that are coming into school speaking differently than they do at home are actually bilingual. What a gift, right? So the answer to the question, is there a way to politely ask them for different phrasing, is yes. I understand the sensitivity of the question about the line between appreciating and borrowing black culture and stealing or appropriating it. Consider a few facts. Benjamin Banneker was never given credit for his role in the completion of the plans for the District of Columbia. Bo Derek made cornrows popular. And the soulful sounds of Elvis Presley were really representative of black blues and gospel singers. He is quoted as saying, "I got it from them." Historically, black inventors and the like have not received full credit for their creation. This is of great concern to black people. I knew I was going to struggle over his name. Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I have it in phonetics here and still say it wrong. Did you know that it stands for Egypt, that it's actually he said, I'm named after a country. He said everybody else in his family had other names, and he was named after a continent or country or continent. Nubia, that's what it is. Nubia is what it means. Anyway, I digress. He spoke clearly about this when asked about white people using the word nigger. He said, when you're white in this country, you're taught that everything belongs to you. You think you have the right to everything. You're conditioned to this. It's not because of your hair and its texture or your skin tone. It's the fact that the laws and the culture tell you this. You have a right to go where you want to go, do what you want to do, be however. And people just have to accommodate themselves to you. Now, whether or not you fully agree with his explanation, we must agree it does bear some reflection considering what history has already shown us. I would like to think that if one has a love for a culture, they will seek to fully understand the genre, and not because Bo Derek or Elvis Presley presented it in a whitewashed format. Another group of questions were about my personal experience with whiteness. How do you feel with being a minority in the congregation? Are you afraid of predominantly white towns? Do you ever have a stressed moment and wish to be white? And do you fear white men? I feel safe in my congregation. There are people here who have gone out of their way to share themselves openly in loving kindness. I grew up with a level of ignorance about race. I played in my white friends' hair and ate at their dinner tables. Even to this day, the places I most enjoy going are usually attended by more whites than black people. On the other hand, my fear of white towns is probably built into my DNA. And now, more than ever, I am on high alert in certain situations. I have dismissed certain party of one vacation ideas with the thought of being a black woman alone at a bed and breakfast or on a morning hike in the mountains out of reach of safety. There are even times at work when I'm leery about encounters with white people. You people have gotten brazen. Still, I have never, ever thought I wanted to be a white woman. Truth be told, as a child, I felt like Whoopi Goldberg's character, the little girl who wore the shirt on her head and called it her long, luxurious blonde hair, because our hair doesn't blow in the wind like the ladies on Love Boat. But now my thoughts are black girl magic, black is beautiful, and as India Irie sings, I am not my hair. Make no mistake about it though, honey, I'm not afraid of white men. They're afraid of me. Thank you, Richard. The last group of questions were concerning racially fired words like slave driver, white privilege, white superiority, beginning a dialogue, and racial genetics. According to Grammarist.com, there are two considerations with the phrase slave driver. First, the term has been used since 1790 to mean exactly what you think it means. I say again that it is most remarkable that American history has been taught to us both the same way. And after so many years of being convinced certain things were just as they say they were, I'm also relearning that most of those lessons are grounded in racism. The second thing to consider is all those slave driver and other words like that are not usually considered offensive words. Part of checking one's privilege is to practice recognizing the audience. So let me speak briefly about privilege. As I see it, at this point in our collective growth, the importance of acknowledging white privilege is a practice, like any other practice. If you are interested, troubled, or passionate about what is happening in this country, you don't need to profess your privilege to me or any other black person. It's a personal journey. Take charge of it, own it, and figure out where it comes up in your life and change it. If you know you are in the presence of folks that do not hold up your standards of racial justice, you have a responsibility to call them out. You can begin the dialogue amongst yourselves, and not just when you are in church or at a rally, but when you are with uncle and auntie and they are speaking against your principles at a barbecue or Thanksgiving dinner. That's how white privilege benefits the whole of us all. If each white person in this room told another person outside of this room what they truly stand for and refused to listen and accept something other than that truth, I believe the answer to the question, can white supremacy be removed, is yes. When I talked to several folks about the questions of racial genetics, I received the same reply every time. Race is a cultural construct. And it's really funny, I'm off script. Every time I said that, that was the first words out of their mouth. And they looked at me with this straight face like, race is a cultural construct. In an article titled Race, the Power of Illusion, it was confirmed, as the author writes, race was created. Scientist Pilar Osorio reports there is no genetic markers in everybody of a particular race and nobody of another race designating their race. There is no markers that identify race. In his paper, The State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson made the statements that began the separation of slave and white men, specifically speaking against the mixing of races. Yet he forced race mixing on Sally Hemings. My question is, how could the children mixed with superior blood be inferior? Wouldn't that change the dynamics? Or is this once again that spoon feeding we have all received that has been layered upon layered on us up until this day? Author Debbie Orr writes, the myth of race was invented by racism, and racism keeps it alive. Recently, while pondering the idea of race, I heard a hip-hop artist state, Black people didn't make it about race. I asked a Black male coworker the final question, why is there an us versus them? All lives matter. His reply, all lives matter is the goal. Black Lives Matter is part of the process. Black Lives Matter is being drowned out by the words, all lives matter. And the fact that we still are involved in this dialogue means we have not reached our goal. A friend and an ally told me the idea of Black Lives Matter is built into the very principles of our faith. Bear with me for a few minutes as I do a quick review timeline here. Africans stolen from Africa and called racially different for the purpose of enslavement, freed and then enslaved again through the 13th Amendment, enslaved again through Jim Crow, lynched and murdered, separated but not equal, hosed, dogs, guns, humiliation, racial slurs, more killings during the civil rights movement. All we wanted was what white folks had since my ancestors were kidnapped. Redlining after my uncles came home from war, where they fought and lived in separation from fellow white soldiers, and then Black Lives protested. One of those protesters was Lacia Evans, the young black woman that stood poised in front of fully armed police with guns drawn as she prepared to be arrested for protesting the murder of Alton Sterling. And in a contrasting story outside of Oregon, there were white militia males who commandeered government property, vehicles and buildings in tactical gear and long rifles for over 4 weeks. A few of these men had been convicted of federal crimes prior to this incident, and yet they left the federal wildlife refuge with no consequence. Did you know that President Trump pardoned those folks this year in July? I will close with this. With a show of hands, who in this blessed sanctuary would be a black man or a black woman at any time in American history? The answer to the question, why the sign, why the division, is all lives matter when Black lives matter. Amen.